Greetings and welcome to Ghost Stories of Washington. Hopefully you're having an enjoyable day today. Chapter 5, The Road Well Traveled, Part 2, with 3 stories in it: Life-Saving Entity, Disappearing Date, and a Haunted Intersection. And for our first story, Life-Saving Entity. Although Rufus Porter would later become a noted American journalist, in December of 1960, the man was utterly down and out, tired, hungry, and discouraged. He was making his way west from Spokane toward Seattle in the hopes of finding work. His method of transportation was the only one he could afford. Porter was riding the rails, stowing away on freight trains headed in the same direction as he. On this particular night, the only rail car Porter could access was both empty and open. Because the train would be making its way through the Cascade Mountains that night, and because the temperature was predicted to fall below zero, Porter knew there was a very good chance that he would freeze to death and not live to see the morning. Even so, he could see no alternative. Staying behind the side of the road offered even less protection from the elements. Porter climbed aboard. If only there'd been some mailbags or other freight in the car, he could have built himself a protective nest. The fact that his senses were numbed by lack of nourishment and extreme fatigue was, in an odd way, a blessing. His conscious mind could not fully comprehend the horror of this life-threatening dilemma. As the train jerked to start and begin the noisy pickup speed, Porter was thrown against the wooden side of the car. Here goes nothing, he thought, and settled back to let fate do with him what it would. He stared aimlessly at the passing countryside, occasionally escaping to unconsciousness. Porter was fully awake, however, when the train approached Leavenworth. He rubbed his eyes to make sure they weren't playing tricks on him. There, at the side of the track bed, was a work camp. Porter's hopes soared. He had learned from experience that he and food at such camps. Grabbing his gunny sack, he jumped from the moving car in the practiced way of the hobo. He let himself go limp and rolled into a deep bed of snow that had accumulated in the culvert between the tracks and the tents. Stumbling in deep snow, his movements hampered even further by his deteriorated physical strength, Porter made his way a few yards back to the tents. He headed for the largest of the makeshift shelters, intending to call out for help when he got close enough. The poor, destitute, half-frozen man may actually have done that. We'll never know exactly what Porter did as he approached the refugee, because his next conscious memory was of waking up in a comfortable cot covered with wool blankets. Struggling to open his eyes, Porter caught a glimpse of a man standing at the foot of the bed on which he was lying. "Thank you," he mumbled, hoping he sounded even a fraction as grateful as he felt. The man merely nodded, and Porter drifted back to sleep. Some time later he blinked his eyes open again. His caretaker was standing in the same place, still staring down at him. "Who are you?" Porter inquired. "I am your brother," the stranger responded. Too groggy to stay awake or to make any sense of the man's cryptic reply, Rufus Porter closed his eyes once again. It wasn't until he woke for a third time that Porter was able to stay awake. By then, the man who had been watching over him was in another area of the tent, seemingly working away at something in the corner. As consciousness imposed itself more and more, Rufus became aware that the man was cooking. Better still, he was cooking bacon and eggs. Perhaps he would share. Shakily, Rufus pulled himself up to the sitting position. As soon as he did, the man was beside him, handing him a full plate heaped high with bacon, eggs, hash browns, potatoes, and thick slices of buttered toast. It had been weeks since Rufus had seen a proper meal, and he ate ravenously, without so much as a thank you to the man who had prepared and served the meal. Once the plate was empty, Porter looked up somewhat sheepishly. "Thank you," he said, with great sincerity, before repeating his question of some hours ago. "Who are you?" "I am your brother," the man said. Not knowing what else to do, Rufus Porter began to make himself ready to depart the work camp and the man who had undoubtedly saved his life. As he took his leave, Porter again thanked the kind stranger. "I appreciate all you did for me," Rufus told the man. "I am sure we've never even met before, and you've probably saved my life. Thank you for your kindness. If I had any way of repaying you, I would." In reply, the man merely repeated, "I am your brother." Refreshed, Porter made his way directly to Leavenworth, where he met up with a few of his acquaintances, men with whom he had ridden the rails on previous occasions. He described in detail the work camp at the side of the tracks and the good Samaritan who had saved him from hypothermia and starvation. "You're crazy, Porter," one of the oldest in the group declared. "That camp hasn't been there for years. The guy you're talking about sounds like old Joe, but he's been dead for ages. You must have been further out of your mind than you thought you were to believe that you were staying in places that don't exist and talking to dead people." Confused, Rufus Porter resisted the temptation to make any sort of a reply. He merely set out for what he thought would be the final leg of his trip westward to Seattle. Instead, he found himself strongly drawn back toward the east. He realized that he could not rest easily until he saw that work camp again. He needed to prove to himself that both the place and the person had, in fact, been real. When he arrived back at the spot from which he had set out that morning, Rufus Porter could only stand stock still and stare. There before his eyes were the tumbled-down, weathered ruins of a work camp that must have existed many seasons before. Nowhere was there recent habitation. Nowhere was there any trace of life. Even so, the future journalist knew that this was the exact spot where just hours before he had received life-saving care and protection from what he now realized was a ghost. Right? Well, our second of 3 stories for today. The next story is entitled Disappearing Date. Disappearing Date. Eugene Trundy will remember one particular day from 1986 for the rest of his life. It was the day he found himself passing through Stillwater, just east of Redmond, Washington. After afternoon, Trundy befriended a young woman named Jill Parker. The two spent some time together in the afternoon, and before they parted, Eugene asked if he could see her again that evening. Even at the time, Jill's answer struck Trundy as being a little odd. She replied, "I hope so." Trying to overlook Jill's strange choice of words, Trundy asked where he might pick her up for the date. She named an intersection and suggested that they meet there, as she lived just along the street from that corner. After agreeing to rendezvous at the meeting spot at 7:30 that evening, the pair parted. Trundy had some dinner, freshened up, and arrived at the designated corner a little early. He wasn't at all worried to see that Jill had not yet arrived. When she still hadn't shown up by 8, however, he became concerned. He went back to the diner where he'd eaten his meal and began to make inquiries about the woman he had been hoping to meet. Trundy was surprised to find the waiter, a man named Bill, pouring him a glass of beer, even though he had not asked for one. "Drink," Bill told him, "and when the glass is empty, there's more where that came from. It's on the house." Trundy had no way of knowing that Bill and the others who worked at the diner had heard many stories about Jill Parker over the past 10 years. It seems that Jill had committed suicide in 1976, immediately after hearing the news that her young son had been in a fatal car accident. Ever since, people around the diner will occasionally hear stories from visitors in their community who claim to have been conversing with a woman meeting Jill Parker's description. A few times there were even reports of Jill and her son being spotted walking together toward their house, before simply vanishing. After hearing what Bill had to say and realizing that he had made a date with a ghost, it is likely that Eugene Trundy was glad to have unasked for a glass of beer. And then in our third and final story for this episode, a haunted intersection. A haunted intersection. Ellensburg, located at almost exactly the geographic center of the state of Washington, is a pretty community, as you're likely to find anywhere. And it has always been, except for the intersection of 7th Avenue and Pine Street. For years, that corner was widely acknowledged to have been haunted with a dark aura. This ghost story dates back to the days of the Wild West. One day in 1895, a group of vigilantes decided, without bothering to engage in the time-consuming protocol of a proper trial, that a particular father and son, the Messrs. Vincent, were guilty of murder, with considerably few thoughts of justice than of expediency. The mob hanged the two men at the corner of 7th and Pine. For many years thereafter, and with great justification, the people in the community avoided that part of town after dark. Although phantom images of the wronged men were never seen, their horrible cries were to have echoed throughout the neighborhood. Their ghosts called out for the help and lawfulness and death that were denied them in life. By now, those distraught energies seem to have dissipated, and the area is no longer thought to be haunted. Hopefully you enjoy these stories of ghost stories of Washington, and I look forward to seeing you in our next episode. Take care and have a wonderful and blessed day. Bye for now, and beware of strangers unaware. You never know what might happen as we ponder what goes on in the afterlife. Take care. Have a wonderful and blessed